over to you.
Okay, excellent. So I'll share my screen and bring the presentation up. Right, everybody see the presentation okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So I'm glad, given the introductions, which were very handy, that I'm not trying to teach you to suck eggs and do kind of an ITIL 101 session, because I felt like that would be the wrong way to run this. So what I've chosen to do is these are almost slides to summarize some things around service management and provoke questions in certain areas. So I'm happy that we originally envisaged these sessions that we would walk our way through and that people would ask questions at the end. What we found in some of the earlier sessions today, and I know some of you have joined us for some, or in one case, all of them, perhaps that deserves a badge of some sort. Then we're happy to stop after each slide, and if questions have come up at that point, then we'll pick them up there. So we're happy to adopt that as we need to. My view is that service management is very much like many parts of the organization about people, process, and tools. And what I've shown here is a view of the sorts of roles that would be involved in service management, the sorts of process areas at a very high level that are involved, and I do talk more about the processes in a future slide, and then the sorts of tools that I would consider to be part of service management. None of these are exhaustive, because I'd need a very small font and a lot more time to walk through that in terms of a structure and the roles and the processes and so on. So it's to give a flavour and to provoke questions and get feedback on people's views and any questions or advice that people are looking for. So in terms of people, I thought about putting the customer at the middle, because that felt like a nice consultancy thing to do, but chose not to. So I distinguish between a customer, which I typically describe as the primary person involved in delivering a service to. Often the person, in my view, is picking up the bill for the service in some way. And the consumer of that service, whether they be a consumer internally within an organization or somebody outside the organization who's consuming that service in some way. So I would have a distinction between the customer, who's the buyer, if you like, of the service, and the consumer who would use that service in some way. The remainder of the roles are primarily about delivering service. So they would be a service manager, which you'll find a role that has many different terms in different organizations. That's where it differs from project management, in that a project manager is by and large called a project manager in most organizations. I've seen service managers called a range of roles with a slightly different set of roles and responsibilities between organizations. Service desk, and I make no apology for talking about the importance of service desk and mentioning that, in my view, a number of organizations don't take service desk as the front door and the voice of service out there to the customer enough. Incident problem change managers. I will also highlight, during this current period of lockdown in the UK and in many parts of the world, the fact that business continuity and the ability to be able to do business in different circumstances is very important to us at the moment. I'll always mention asset management and configuration management. There are then a range of support teams that will have different roles. Some people talk about infrastructure, some people talk about applications. The way those are structured can vary by organization. Of course, suppliers, whether they be somebody that's directly involved in providing support behind a service desk or sat there providing third or fourth line support and subject matter expertise to second line support teams. And project managers and beyond that, architects and designers who are part of delivering change into the organization. So I've tried to give a feel for the fact that there's a large number of people involved in service. And one of the ways of answering the question of who's involved in delivering services, well, it's pretty much everybody. Everybody from the user of that service through the specific service teams that deliver it to the other parts in an IT organization and suppliers outside. In terms of processes, I'm currently following, so I don't reference ITIL specifically here, because I'm acutely aware that there are other frameworks that some organizations have chosen to use. But those of you who know ITIL, and particularly ITIL v3 well, will know I've used the service lifecycle stages here. So service strategy, service design, service transition, service operations, and then continual service improvement, providing that view across all of them to improve. I do talk about processes more on a future slide, so I wasn't going to drain this and spend a huge amount of time talking about it here, but clearly having those processes and the interfaces between them are very important to the delivery of good service, and also making sure that processes from other parts of the organisation, particularly project management, feed in. And again, I've got some thoughts and some comments on that to come in a future slide. And finally, in terms of tools, so the tools are primarily around automating and helping and providing us with repositories. Many people will have a specific tool that will cover many of these. Could be ServiceNow, could be Access Assist, could be Remedy. We'll cover a number of these. So the incident and service request logging and tracking, typically through Service Desk, could be one of those tools. There could be an asset inventory as part of that with a configuration management database or CMDB behind it. It would also store the knowledge base and provide a level of self-service. So the current range of service management tools will provide many of those. Again, I don't apologize for talking about Service Desk a lot. The ability for Service Desk to be able to take phone calls, the ability for them to support self-service if needed, could be tech bars, could be a drop-in center depending on the organization, could be a chat, the number of ways of providing that, and those are becoming increasingly sophisticated over time. I will mention monitoring and alerting. Obviously, if something goes wrong in a service, then the ability for support teams to pick that up 24/7 and respond to that is important. And in this current lockdown time, but also something that I've seen emerging was when I first started managing and attending change advisory boards or CABs. Those would be face-to-face meetings. So you would typically convene in a room at the designated time of the week. You would go through them change by change, and it would be a face-to-face meeting. Those then moved to phone conference, and I'm now seeing with the advent of Teams and other unified communications systems, the ability to run those virtually, so you're not taking up a meeting room and people can join from anywhere in the world over video. Sharing screens like this is becoming prevalent, and the same will start to apply to other meetings, including major incident reviews and in many respects running the major incidents and the resolution themselves. I put Service Catalog down as a tool primarily because I'm talking about Service Catalog as a self-service way of asking for things in the organization. There are other definitions of Service Catalog, and again, if people want to expand more on that either here or in a one-to-one session, then happy to do so. I'll pause at that point because that slide I expect may generate some questions, but if there aren't any, then happy to move on to the next one.
So one of the questions that I'll just pose, Mark, straight away, it's in the chat, is are we covering ITIL 4? So do your slides afterwards cover it? Especially the differences, I guess, between ITIL 4 and 3 is
no, but I can cover it. I'll tell you what, I'll cover it in the next slide, which I know does talk about processes. I've deliberately kept this to ITIL 3 terms because that's the version that I think most people are used to working on. ITIL 4 is still relatively new, and there aren't many organizations that have actually moved to it, but I have looked at it and have got some knowledge and insight into it, so I can share that on the next slide.
Right. So, and I can help if need be with that, because I've gone through the managing professional transition. So, I know what's in ITIL 4, so I can help if need be, but I'll, try not to get too involved. There are some other questions, and so we'll cover ITIL 4 on the next slide, but let me just pose some other questions to you, Mark, now for this slide.
Yep.
So one of them is difference between client and customer.
I would say that the customer, in my mind, is the primary person you are delivering the service to. That's how I've seen it in my head. If you were writing an SLA, they would be the person who would sign off on behalf of the people that consume that. I'd say a client, to me, either means somebody outside the organization. So there could be many clients for a service, or it could be that actually it's for a shared service, and these shared services can in some large organizations get quite complicated to work out how you're going to agree the level of service and then review and manage that on an ongoing basis, because something like email or a desktop service is actually used by everybody and there's no one defined customer. So I would see them as clients. There will be some large organization heads who are very, very keen to make sure that emails can flow within an organization, but you would typically want to find one customer who is the service owner or the person who consumes that service, and would effectively then pay the bill, agree the service level, and review performance. That's how I see it in my terms, but I do understand some organizations will be more interchangeable in terms of how they would use those names.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I've seen it in both, but I think you've answered the question. So some organizations use client to mean the customer, and yeah. So I think you've answered that. So that's helpful. So another question to yourself, Mark, and then maybe we'll open it up to John and Deb as well, is what's the difference between service portfolio and service catalog? So you mentioned both here.
Yeah, so service catalog, I usually describe as meaning one of two things because I've seen people use it in two different ways. A service catalog in traditional good practice would be a list of services that IT provides to consumers and customers, and that those consumers and customers would recognize they use. So you could talk about an email service, you could talk about service desk being a service, you could talk about the ability to access the internet and intranet, so external internet sites. You could talk about a managed desktop service, you could talk about specific applications, typically those that are most critical. So that could be a catalogue of services against which you would typically maintain an amount of information about that service, including its criticality to the organization. That's one definition of a service catalog, and it's what you describe as the more traditional ITIL definition of what a service catalog is. There are some more sophisticated versions that have a business service catalog that face out to the business, and then a technology service catalog, which will be things that underpin that. So, for example, you might have networks as an underpinning service because people don't consume that directly, but without a network, you're not going to be able to access applications or the intranet. The other way I've seen service catalog referred to is what I was kind of talking to in the presentation on the slide is it's a list of things you can buy. It's almost like an Amazon list of, I want a monitor, I want a mouse, I want access to this application. I've seen people refer to service catalog in effect mean self-service way of asking for access to or to procure hardware or software for them to use as part of their IT service. Service portfolio, I'd see as being more back in the service strategy space. So it's about thinking about what are the services that you're offering today? What of those services do you want to think about potentially retiring over time or replacing with something else? And what are the new services you'll want to offer in the short term or long term? If you're part of an internal IT organization, that would be because you can see an emerging demand from the business. If you're providing service externally, then that could be based on competitor analysis or where you've seen a gap in the market and so on. So I'd see that portfolio being broader than what services do I offer today, and being something that's more about what would I want to think about retiring over time, and what would I think about introducing and moving on to in the future. And I'd see that as part of a strategy piece of work with architecture teams and so on.
Okay. And you've covered that comprehensively. So I'll just we'll go on to your next slide, and then I'll bring Dev and John Mills on some other queries later on. Yeah. So yeah, if you move on, please.
Cool. Yeah, will do. I put this slide up because I've done work with a couple of organizations looking at how we can improve their service management. And typically this comes down to talking about process and capability. And I, in a very basic terms, talk about the various service management processes and disciplines. And again, these are ITIL v3 terms typically, although many of them do equate both back to previous versions of ITIL and to ITIL v4. So you describe service desk as being reactive. Somebody will phone up and wants to raise an incident, wants to know how to resolve something, wants to raise a request for something. You would have incident management, primarily restoring service when something isn't working. I've deliberately split problem management into the reactive problem management of an incident has occurred. How do we understand and review that incident for lessons learned? And how do we identify root cause to prevent recurrence? Change management, all about the ability to make change and to review them through cabs and so on. The management of assets, both hardware assets, has an inventory, and software assets, a software library, and so on. Licenses, usage, etc. Configuration management and the CMDB. Now, I wouldn't see that as necessarily being something that every organization has matured, and there's lots of conversations we could have around CMDBs, but I'd see that being primarily reactive. The reporting of service, so how service is performed against targets, is reactive because it typically takes place after the event. Monitoring and alerting, so by that I mean when something has failed, a monitoring tool detects it and it's picked up by a service desk, a second line support team, or a supplier, and action is taken, primarily following the incident process in most cases. And then the management of knowledge, so from projects or from problems provided to service desk to enable them to either help a consumer self-service, or effectively to help gather more information where required. And I think many organizations struggle to move from those reactive pieces because there's a lot of work to do. And once you've got a number of those services up and running, then that can take an amount of time just to keep the lights on and keep things moving. Whether it be managing incidents, whether it be managing problems, whether it be managing change, and then introducing new services, just that can consume an amount of time and effort. And to actually then get the bandwidth and the work to move on to things that I've deliberately shaded in a different color and put on the right-hand side around proactive. So that would be proactive problem management, thinking about things that haven't happened yet, where you've got trends from monitoring and alerting that says, you know what, if we don't do anything, then this could be an issue in the future. Service level management, which I'm defining here as not specifically just setting service level agreements, but also saying, you know, if we set a service level that says we want to make sure that we've got a certain number of incidents in the year, major incidents in the year, and want to keep below that, then a couple of months in, if we're starting to trend in the wrong way, what actions would we need to take to get that back on track? So it's more proactive, it's doing things rather than waiting to be prompted by events. Service catalog management can do the same. You could argue that could sit on the proactive and reactive side, and I'm always happy to have a good conversation around where they might sit. Capacity management, so making sure that you've got the right capacity in the right place at the right time for the right cost, for the right reason. Availability management, I have seen done really well once, and I owe the person who did it well credit. He would do a deep dive review of a particular system. He would look to identify ways in which availability could be improved. You know, that's what I can see an availability management process doing well, and I don't see many organizations getting to that level of maturity, but there's a huge amount that can be done there. I think service continuity as part of the broader business continuity work is now very important. We're now beginning to realize, particularly through the pandemic and lockdown in many parts of the world, that actually we need to think about how we're going to continue to provide service away from our buildings, which is probably not something that every organization have as part of their continuity plans. But I can tell you what, following lockdown, it's going to be a key part of every organization's work and plan. I did consider making continual service improvement a specific slide and chose not to, because in the interest of time, I wanted to make sure that we've got enough time to talk about it. But I am a big advocate of making sure that every process owner has a service improvement plan, and that there is then a broader service improvement plan that doesn't just look at the process, but also looks at tools, looks at training, looks at what customers are looking for, looks at what suppliers are telling us, that there is a service improvement plan and program which looks to continue to move service along and doesn't just rely on projects coming along and touching things. Clearly, you've also got areas that are possibly beyond ITIL, talking around supplier management, product roadmaps, and I do start to talk more about the things that I've left a trailer for there in terms of emerging trends. So I want to describe the fact that some organizations feel a bit stuck on the reactive side, and that making headroom to get the proactive side is important. I would say that journey is worth it, because if you want to drain the swamp in the reactive side, then the proactive side is a way of doing that. I did promise to talk around ITIL v4. ITIL v4 is not a revolution. It does not introduce massively different things. It is packaged in different ways. So it introduces a dimension model, 4 dimensions model, that introduces a service value system. It expands what was the tried and tested ITIL framework, which I previously described as documented common sense. That's very much where the original ITIL work came from, driven by public sector in the UK, so government organisations in the UK documented what was good common sense, and it's gradually evolved through from there. There is more guidance in ITIL v4 for practitioners, and I think one of the things that I've previously accused ITIL of not doing well is being able to integrate with other frameworks. So, for example, Agile, so for example, DevOps and so on. And I think the world has continued to move beyond ITIL. And I think there have been times when ITIL has tried to stretch itself beyond service management, and that integration with other frameworks hasn't gone well. And I can see that's something that, as part of the V4 work, has definitely been improved. My view is that if somebody's on V3 and that's working well, and there aren't any particular problems to solve, then I wouldn't see an urgency to move to ITIL V4, but I would see it being part of a roadmap in the future. So it is a question of when, not if. But I think some organisations, if they're struggling at the moment during lockdown to keep the lights on, then would I say ITIL V4 will give them an answer to a number of those questions? My view is probably not. But I would see it being something that would be part of a strategy and a roadmap to move to that version in the future.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So I'll probably add a couple of things from my perspective around ITIL 4, but we'll come to that afterwards. If I could just pose a few questions to yourself, Mark, that have been asked. So I think there's 2 or 3. So the first one being, what's the difference between asset management and config management?
And it's a great question, by the way. Asset management is about tracking individual components. So an asset will be a server from a hardware asset viewpoint, a desktop, a laptop. So it will be tracking those. And from a software viewpoint, it will be an application or a license that's installed. And the asset management process and the inventories that sit behind that are around making sure that you know where things are, in terms of laptops, desktops, and servers, what make and model they are, and so on, and having an up-to-date list of them. The difference between an asset inventory and a configuration management database is an asset inventory is a list. You could almost make it a spreadsheet. A configuration management and a configuration management database brings in the concept of a relationship between things. So it will tell you that that particular server relies on and uses a particular database that may be hosted on another server. It may well use a network connection to manage that. It will run one or more applications that form part of other services. So a configuration management database effectively does 2 things. It brings the relationship between things together to provide an overall picture of how service is provided, and it goes beyond the asset management. So I always describe the hardware asset as you can go along and actually physically tap it. Now, I know people, if I went into a server room and tried to tap a server, I would be escorted out very quickly, but it's something you can physically touch, whereas software is typically something that's installed. But it starts to take you into the business. So a configuration management database would describe a service, it would describe business areas and customers and so on, and it would describe the relationship between them, whereas an asset management asset inventory and asset management is about managing those things almost as lists to keep them up to date.
Okay. And another question which made me smile, because Nish responded to Mashfik's initial question, is why is access management missing in action?
Because I didn't want to drain every ITIL process, and these were the ones that came to mind when I wrote these slides on Monday. Access management and service requests I referred to earlier, and I tend to, slightly clumsily and lazily, refer to requests and access in the same breath and think of them as a common process. But yeah, I could add other processes on here, and for the interest of leaving a little bit of white space in here and not making the slides so small, thought I'd focus on the ones that most people will be aware of.
And actually that brings me on nicely to just a couple of points I want to mention on ITIL 4, which I hope people will find helpful. And it's related in that, look, I counted, I think you have about 18 processes listed here, or something like that. And in ITIL v3, I can't remember now offhand, but there's either 27 or 28 recognized processes. And so one of the differences with ITIL 4, and I won't go and name them all, is that in ITIL 4, as far as I remember, again, there are 34 practices. So from 28 to 34. And I deliberately use the word processes in ITIL v3 and practices for ITIL 4, because that's just one difference between the two, that they've now called them practices, but you touched on that earlier anyway, Mark. So that's just one aspect related to this slide. Something else I'll mention, I don't think you've covered yet, is, of course, we know in ITIL v3, we have the life cycle approach of strategy, design, transition, operation, and continual service improvement. Whereas in ITIL 4, If you're not familiar with this already, they've got rid of all of that. So forget this life cycle type approach. They have the value system, which encompasses it. It's far too complicated and still in its infancy for us to go into it in the time that we have now, but it's just at a high level for you to know that they don't necessarily talk about strategy design anymore. They talk about the value system. There are some other components of ITIL 4 as well that you may hear, or you've either heard or you may hear, such as the guiding principles. So these are kind of guiding principles for every area of good stuff that you should be doing. And they talk about high velocity IT. This is, again, Mark, you touched on it, around embracing other frameworks, the future, fast IT, agile, etc. So they did need to change from V3 to V4, as you mentioned, but I also agree with you that for most organizations and people, right now, at least for another 6 months, if not longer, they should stick to what they're doing with ITIL V3. But at some point, I guess people will start making small amendments here and there, right?
Yeah.
So, Dev or John, anything to add from yourselves?
Not me, thanks.
Okay.
No, I'm good.
Okay. So let's move on then. So if you carry on, Mark.
Okay. Yep. So I thought I'd close with a couple of areas that I hope would provoke some discussion. Firstly, and I think it come up as a question at one point in the Slack channel. Service introduction or service transition, different organizations call it the same, call it different things, seems to be a struggle. So it seems to be a struggle for organizations to get from the delivery of something through a project or a program into the service organization. And so why that should be, not who, just so many organizations seem to struggle. I think some of this is down to the fact that there are different cultures and the operating rhythm between project organizations who are temporary constructs to specifically deliver something, and their reason for existing is to get that thing over the line, and they have a drive to do so, versus service organizations who are typically running very hard to keep the lights on, and something else which is coming along can sometimes feel difficult to actually accommodate. And early in my career, I remember having my then line manager taking me to one side and saying, I had a reputation for when projects came along, just said, we haven't got time, you're not ready, the answer is no. And the manager said quite rightly, you can't always say no, Mark, eventually we're going to have to make a change. So, we have to find a way of bridging that gap between the way in which projects want to work and the way in which service and operations want to work. So I thought I'd write down a few things that in my experience will help. So I think it's never too early for a project team to engage service and support. And I say never because I'm firmly of the view that before you even turn it into a project, so as part of the initiation and business case, you should be thinking about what will be needed for service and support. You should be thinking about that as a longer term cost benefit and so on, and not just saying what will it take to get this over the line and somebody will look after the service stuff in the future. Now, I will happily, over a beverage of your choice, spend time talking about projects that have done a not such a great job of delivering service, but I will equally talk about projects where they had great project managers who really wanted to engage with service teams, but the service teams just wouldn't engage with them, whether they were too busy, just had the wrong mindset, and so on. So it's not just a problem for projects to fix. It's also about making sure that the service and support teams are ready and willing and able for the projects to engage and to effectively answer that question that I put in the middle. What do service and support teams need to have in place to be able to support the service, whether it be a new one or a changed one, from day one? Many organizations try and answer that question by starting with a checklist, and that is useful because it gives projects a series of deliverables that they recognize they can deliver. It, however, has a limit to how far it can go. So I remember many years ago, starting a checklist of things that projects needed to deliver to a server support team I was looking at the time. It started off with 10 questions, and by the time I'd left that organization, it had turned over 12 to 1,200 because it had spread across all the support and service teams, and they'd all thought of something they might need in certain circumstances. And the projects teams just looked at that and said, I'm not sure, I'm ever going to be able to understand or deliver this. And it became something that people would try and actively avoid talking about. So a checklist has some value, but you can only stretch that so far. My view is that the maturity step is then on to designing for service. It's about making sure that the project recognizes that, and the service teams recognize that we need to think about making sure that the project is setting up to run service all the way through. In the business case, through the project initiation document, the deliverables that are required, the work that's required, the testing that's required, the designing, the making sure that everything works before the first person buys something or uses something on that service, making sure the tools are in place, making sure the business continuity is done, making sure that everything is needed to run and operate that service so it can be fed and watered on an ongoing basis, rather than just we've delivered the project and the service will sort itself out later. So again, I'll pause at that point to see if there's any questions. If this generate questions, then I've probably got the wrong audience. So I deliberately made it slightly provocative to generate some questions.
Yeah, but one more basic question, Mark, if you could just address quickly, and I've answered in chat, but just for you to address it.
Yep.
Why have you got service introduction and service transition listed there? Are they the same?
In my view, they are the same thing. So I've seen organizations, and this is one of those things about services, is there are, unlike certain things in project management, where I think most people would recognize a PID as a document, most people would recognize a change request and so on. They're broadly using the same terms. I've seen service managers call different things, and I've seen service introduction or service transition or operational acceptance. That process seems to get called different things, but it broadly does the same thing in different organizations.
Thank you. It's actually making me laugh. I'm getting some abuse from Nish for, how did she put it? Where is it? Thank you for referring to my question as basic. I'm so insulted.
It's been a long day. Yeah. You're doing very well. It's been a long day.
Trust me, it has been a long day. I've been to every single session today.
I know.
You're both doing very well. I think you both deserve a badge.
Exactly. So Nish, as Mark said earlier, you definitely deserve a badge, especially if you attend any of tomorrow's ones as well. But anyway,
I am actually. Some of them I'm going to come again because I found them so interesting. I thought I'm going to, join again.
Great. You're welcome. So let's see if there are other questions in the chat. I don't think that there's anything in the chat. So look, let's just use this opportunity to verbally ask Mark, anything on this slide in particular, or anything else that you have in mind. Remember, this is an Ask Me Anything on service management. So you've got his attention. What would you like to raise with him? Any questions? You're on mute, remember, if you need to unmute yourself. If you don't have any questions, then fine, I can prompt some more, dialogue. But Mark, is this your last slide? Or do
I have one more slide, and
okay.
That's it. And then I've got a kind of sales pitch for the rest of the week.
Okay.
So the last slide I'd got, and I've used this or versions of it in a couple of organisations, is we were talking about Itsm v4 evolving because the world evolves around us, and I just wanted to think about what were the sorts of things that if I was service manager in an organisation and thinking about where service management would go, what would be kind of top of my mind right now. And I've got to be honest, lockdown and the fact that some organisations have had to turn themselves on their head would absolutely be front and centre of my mind. Now, I was doing work with a law firm who was very much of the opinion that their day job was going to their office and using their services, and then going to their client's office and doing work with the client. And in the matter of days, not weeks or months, that model had to turn on its head. And so when lockdown kicked in, everybody was working from home. and just keeping the lights on and making sure that we can still do business and so on, because we're using fundamentally different technologies, would be front of my mind. And that's going to change service management forever. It's going to change service management to a point where we were perhaps very focused on what is the LAN, what is the WAN, what are the connection in offices, and it will start us thinking more about the ability to access services anywhere from home, over personal internet connections and so on. So the way in which we manage service, the way in which devices are used and so on will change, and it will be less focused on offices and more focused on remote working. And for some organizations, they'd already thought that through, and in others, they're having to play catch up and will continue to play catch up for a period. I mention evergreen technologies because it's kind of interesting. I've spent time educating a couple of organizations on the fact that Windows 10 and Office 365 and iOS and Android and some of the technologies we've now got aren't boom and bust anymore. So I remember working on a various Windows rollout projects where you'd go from Windows XP to Windows 7, you might then go to 8 or 8.1, and then you'd implement Windows 10. Well, Windows 10 is the last operating system Microsoft will ever deliver. That's what they say to us, and at the moment I have no reason to doubt them. But it does mean that every 6 months there'll be a new feature release, and unlike Windows 7 and Windows 8.1, where you probably get 5 years out of the operating system and get monthly patches to make sure it's secure and fix bugs, from a Windows viewpoint, you get 18 months of Windows 10, and then that particular feature release will be out of support, and you need to have migrated your entire organization across. So it's not boom and bust anymore, it's little and often. And the same will apply to iOS versions, the same will apply to Office 365, the same will apply to Android. We need to think about, as part of our service management operations, how we're going to see the fact that those versions of those technologies are coming to their end, make sure that we've started the work in sufficient time, tested all of the key applications and devices and usage, and get everybody across in a safe and secure way before that end of support kicks in. Cloud services, I don't think, is as much in many organizations a challenge. I think many have already moved, but there are certain organizations, particularly those that had more security concerns and so on, that cloud vendors are starting to manage. And I think cloud services is really a kind of visible and an active way of recognizing the fact that many organizations are now consuming things from a large number of suppliers, and so more is being done outside of the IT organization than before. And actually, you might not have as much control. So if you look at the various hosting services through the cloud vendors, you will find that some of the things that they will need to do in terms of upgrades, you won't necessarily have a way of saying no to them, because they will be done in terms of maintenance at a time of the cloud vendors choosing. You'll be told that they're doing it within a window. You might not necessarily know exactly when it was. When that was managed in-house, you would have had more influence over when your server team that you're paying the wages of and are working directly for you, when they do it. So there are some differences there, and some organizations have found that an interesting challenge to work to. And I'd mention Agile simply because one of the things that used to drive me mad as a service manager was people talking about a pilot or a prototype of something, and saying that was something different to a service going live, whereas actually I said the moment somebody logs onto it, it's live. So I see Agile as a good thing because it recognizes the fact that something will go live and will then be changed. And I often had a problem with pilots being put live, projects not necessarily recognizing always that they needed to have a level of support around them. I think Agile is a way of thinking more about the fact that service needs to be ready from day one, and it will then evolve pretty quickly. To me, I think that it brings as many opportunities for service management as it does challenges.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So question to you from Ashvik is differences between the change management in ITSM, software development, and project management.
Yeah, so change management is the change of a state in something to do with a service. So it could be a server upgrade, it could be a new version of application, it could be introducing a new service in ITIL and service management terms. It is the change to a state of something, either an introduction of a service or as part of a service. In terms of change management within projects, good practice would say that you would define the scope of a project. So what it's delivering, who to, how many, and so on. would be defined up front, typically as part of the project initiation document. That change management as part of project or program management would be something has changed. So it would be, we've now found that we need to introduce another 1,000 more laptops, or it could be that we've just gone through a merger and we need to think about what a new organization is going to do around that, and projects that are currently in flight need to adopt to that. It could be that a vendor has changed something and we need to accommodate that. It could be that actually the project is delivering ahead of time or slightly behind and needs more money. So it's the change to something around the scope and the budgets and so on of a project would be change management in projects and programs, whereas the change to a service or some component of that would be change management in ITSM terms.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I think that answers it. If you don't feel it does, then please just ask another point in chat. But let me move on to a question from Lavia. So, will the emerging technologies impact the future of ITSM? So, I guess, and there's two aspects to this, Mark, if you can answer. One, how ITSM is impacted by emerging technologies, and obviously, will the emerging technologies, as it says, impact the future of ITSM, and how ITSM supports emerging technologies?
I'll answer that in two ways. I think I would have loved to have had some of the emerging technologies that we now have to be able to run service management when I was first involved in it. The ability to run a session like this where I can share a screen and we can have questions and answers and so on. When I think of some of the difficult meetings I had or some of the email exchanges I had that could have been done like this, I'd love to have had those technologies. I think there are some emerging technologies that are coming in that need us to think about what it will take to support them. So I think from a support viewpoint, and I've described previously kind of the feeding and watering of them on an ongoing basis will be fundamentally different, because the way in which some of those emerging technologies are consumed, the fact that some of them are now 24/7. One of the examples I used is I worked for a global bank who had introduced a bring your own device service with iPads to their most senior exec, and it was seen as a nice to have service until one day the Wi-Fi in that organization, that again was seen as a nice to have service, stopped working. There was due to be an exec meeting with board papers on the iPads, and that didn't work. And so what was seen as a nice to have Wi-Fi that was used by a nice to have bring your own device suddenly became very important, and had to change correction. So it's thinking about the broader implications of introducing those technologies and what that means for the other services and components it talks about. Somebody I worked with once described it as being from URL to SQL. It's from the point of consumption through to the very back end where the data is stored. It's thinking about that and thinking about what those technologies will change from a user viewpoint, from a support viewpoint, and how things connect together. The other thing I'd say is that there are a number of things that are now available in emerging technologies as part of service management. So I was part of the early ServiceNow introduction into that same global bank. At the time, we were the largest customer, and ServiceNow were going through, I'll politely say, some growing pains around their hosting of services and getting individual servers managed well and so on. When I see where that offering is now, both in terms of service management, the chat bots, the ability to both raise calls and manage them on phones and so on, the sheer advanced nature of those. And then I look at what we can do in terms of a configuration management database, importing data, managing the relationships. I see the automation, I see what's available there. I think the emerging technologies and the work that's available now to support service management, it's probably never been a better time to work in service management, because the tools that we have available to us, both within specific tools like ServiceNow, but also, Microsoft Teams, the latest versions of WebEx and tools like Zoom enable us to be able to run virtual meetings that effectively speed things up quite considerably.
Yeah. Slack, of course, that we're using, and
Slack, of course. I always feel like I missed a few when I start listening.
That's all right. So another question, and Mashfiq, thank you for joining this call, because you've asked many questions, so it's been helpful. So thank you. So another question from Mashfiq, in relation to a previous question, is should we have separate change management processes for ITSM and software development in an organization, and even, you know, project management perhaps. So what's your view?
The answer is yes, although they need to relate to each other. So, you know, I would see a change management process in ITIL terms with cabs being a different process with a different owner and a different life cycle to a software development or a project change process. But ultimately, in order to get something that's being delivered through software development or something that's being delivered through a project live, it needs to talk to change management. And I think this is one of the things that I didn't talk to specifically when we talked around processes, but no process is an island, and we need to think about what's upstream, so what feeds into it, what's downstream and relies on it in terms of how they work. And I think this is a classic example where they need to be separate processes, but they need to think about how you're going to transition from one to the other, because nothing will go live from a project or software development unless it goes through change management and cabs.
Great answer, thank you. There was another question earlier, but it had been answered already, and I think the answer is good. And there's one new question, so thank you, and keep them coming in. How should we start designing capacity management process for an organization? So capacity management, where do people begin?
I would typically start with the service that you've got the most monitoring and historic information on. So it's no point trying to think about monitoring and providing capacity plans unless you've got a good amount of historical information. So I see capacity as needing to understand a longer term trend in terms of usage, and it being the marrying of demand both now and in the future against what can be supplied. And a good historical seam of data around how many people have logged on, how many transactions, you know, from a network viewpoint, you know, what was the peak, what was the average, were there any periods where there was perhaps a bottleneck. Having that sort of information is invaluable. And I have seen organizations who've started with something like the network as a place to start their capacity, rather than necessarily trying to start at a higher level and then finding it very hard to understand what the current consumption is, and then finding it virtually impossible to work out what future demand might look like. So, you know, start at the bottom. Start with the areas that you've got good historical information in terms of your monitoring and usage stats, and then use that to work across and up the service stacks.
Okay, thank you. We're nearly out of time, so let me just stop asking about, you know, chat questions. So just for us to wrap up, is there anything else that anyone wants to say verbally, or, you know, discuss a particular point? Anything that hasn't been addressed?
It's John. I just want to add 3 things just from that whole thing. Great presentation, Mark. One was just initially about, I know there was talk about the project space and into operations, and I've been in countless situations where there is resistance to that on both sides. And I was at a seminar once where a project manager stood up and really explained this quite vividly for me. And I'd like to share that now, right? So a project is basically just a scope of work that a project manager has to deliver. So if transition into operations is an absolute necessity, then it's up to operations to make sure that that's in the scope. Because a project manager cannot have a successful project without ticking off all the boxes. So if you make sure that transition to operations is in the project scope, then it can't be a successful project without it. So it's a really good thing to have to say, hey, this needs to be in the scope. The 2 other things, just very quickly, is we've mentioned service management being common sense, and there's a really famous term about common sense is not so common, and people should really, really, really believe that, because it is absolutely true. We can sit there on our laurels and say, well, it's common sense, we should do it, but it's someone who has to actually pick it up and run with it, rather than sit there and kind of dream about it. So be brave, because that bravery creates results. And the last one I want to focus on is the fact that I've seen this quite a lot. IT tends to get really fixated on the processes that they're doing, right? And I'm not saying service management isn't really, really important, but it's an internal thing that we do, right? If I try and use a different analogy from a Telstra perspective, right? We pick up a phone and we want to, you know, dial a number and phone our parents or something, right? We don't care at all about all the infrastructure and processes behind that. We just want to phone the number and get a service, right? That's exactly what customers feel about our services. So from a service management perspective, right, these are all processes that we do internally, and the better we do them, the better the service is. But from a customer perspective, they just look at this as doing our job. You know, so the better we do our job, the better service they get. So it's a really good thing to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you.
That was my 3 points.
Yeah, thank you, John. So any other questions? We're up on time anyway. I think we are probably about complete, but anything else?
Hi, Alim, it's Nish. I just wanted to thank everybody, especially all the mentors. It was a good session.
Yeah, thank you, Nish. So yeah, on that note, Mark, thank you very, very much. It was a good session, great presentation. Thank you, Dev and John, for supporting, and all the questions from Nish to him, Lavia and Mashfiq, who has left, and I think there was one other person who dropped as well. So great. So thank you very much. I'll stop the recording there, and I look forward to speaking with some of you tomorrow. Thank you all.